The Nightsman. It was late one chilly night when I drove my Chevrolet Silverado through the ramshackle gates of the Avalanche. The engine roared before I silenced it with a rattle. I wasn't waking anyone up except for Harry. He almost lived in another dimension, one that existed behind his television and comprised of crying babes and slick, greasy men with a loud accent. An hour later, my attention wasn't on the 20-inch screen that lit up the room. As I got buried into my fluffy white mattress and felt cold despite being blanketed by thick, dusty quilt. I kept wondering as to how I had ended up in that dank cave of a room. I was trying to adjust to the new setting that I had moved into. A room close to the busy highway, a distant feeling from the whirring echoes of that crazy metropolitan lifestyle that I had left behind. It was nearly a month to Christmas, so the streets were lit up and teemed with drunk merry-goers who kept losing their way and bumped into me. Every time I prowled the roads that connected empty, hollow establishments to orthodox houses at night. There was one of those very nights when I took long reaching steps and shivered in my thick beach jacket. It was cold, something that maybe made me think of cracks in a frozen lake that threatened to break and swallow me into its abyss, and kept my blood running all the way up to my carelessly numb brains. I thought of calling my ex, who still prospered under the million lights of the city, yet I wanted to get rid of that thought for good. Chains of multicolored lights flashed weakly from beyond the mist. They decorated the facades of narrow buildings that spread evenly, far in the distance. The road rolled into the foggy night, and the cold bit into me as I puffed out little white clouds and ambled on ahead. I came by the unmanned petrol pump. Few lights flickered above locked wooden doors behind the filing stations. Tire marks stretched everywhere, as seen underneath those faltering sodiums. Nobody bothered fixing the broken board that flashed weakly as it stood there and displayed the rates. Further on, all that was around was a sparsely populated thicket of dry trees that rose from an ocean of black. I knew where I was going when I looked up at the clear dark skies and depended on the moonlight that paved my way on the gravel and asphalt. The road led to the highway, where I occasionally went to clear my head and watched cars speed by, unmindful of the legal limit. Another landmark along my road of solitude was too odd to ever forget: an old abandoned radio station, lost somewhere in the woods. If I heard right, it stopped functioning in the 80s when the group decided to sell out to another corporation. That in turn went insolvent, and the logical explanation being that it was jinxed. I saw the radio tower rise in front of me, even though that fog clouded my vision, and knew the highway was near. I stood like a scarecrow beneath a tree, watching the empty highway stretch far and wide. A severely dented signboard that gleamed with the moon kept me company. It was Saturday night, and while most went dizzy while gyrating to 1,000 flashing lights and swinging down shots at nightclubs far in the city, there I was, shivering in the cold and watching some run-down old road like it were a movie. I heard distant sounds of a vehicle approaching from miles away. Definitely didn't sound like a truck. The car approached, with its headlights cutting perfect cones through the mist. It was an old Mercury Bobcat. Who even drives that old grunting horse anymore? I wondered. I stared on, puzzled as to why it slowed down, and tried to look into its windows. Layers of mist separated me from the car. Here I could make out the old school paint job wearing off and oversized dents on its doors. The man on the wheel had his hair greased behind in that slick 70s style, like one of the many characters from Harry's favorite shows, although he was a dark silhouette from where I stood. He turned his head to look at me, an empty face veiled by shadows. featureless almost. Even though it was pitch black inside the car, it felt as though I was staring at my own reflection on someone else's face, behind those moon bleached windows. Only the reflection wasn't me, an imitation that otherwise would have been nothing more than a hollow mannequin abandoned by its penniless owner. An uneasiness crawled up my spine. It was nothing like the shivers from the cold. My gloved fist clenched deep into my front pockets, and I turned to leave. I did not understand how ice bored deep into the back of my neck, though I conjured up a stray whistling tune. The bobcat then rode away, with a sudden thrust of its engines, and left me alone. Weird people on a Saturday night, I tried to tell myself, lots of them back in the city. Some were punch drunk and leaned over their friends while singing old songs that no one cared for. Others were in a frenzy to break the city limits of their fancy cars. Yet this was nothing like that. The eventuality of my inhibitions clung on like clammy dead weight as I walked down the path from where I came. A weak breeze darted past and helped me regain my blood flow to a state of normalcy. Rumbling engines echoed again. My breath stopped and I did not turn to look. It grew louder and the night vibrated with those metallic pistons. The hair at the back of my neck stood erect. But then I turned and it was there, standing 10 feet away. The bad medium brown paint job blended into its charred black hood. Its rectangular headlights were blinding, and the semi-folded grille with a broken bumper hanging underneath it made the front appear bent, almost making it resemble a sadistic smile. What the hell do you want? The question seared through my racing mind. Yet everything incomprehensible in the dark reached out to silence my voice. The car inched ahead in sudden spurts as it kept emitting plumes of smoke. He switched to reverse and my feet remained grounded as I stood there, staring blankly at the deformed sedan. It drove at me through the night with the faceless man leaning over his wheels. Even though I couldn't think or comprehend what was about to happen, something took over my senses and I jolted to the side of the road, narrowly missing the oncoming mass of metal. I fell underneath one of the winter trees and saw from the corner of my eyes the sedan screech to a sudden halt, and a few sparks trailed the pattern of rubber that it left behind. He started to reverse. I knew I had to disappear and get out of sight of those threatening headlights, so I ran into the woods and collided against one of the trees, coarse bark against my forehead, and a trickle of blood down to my lips. The vague lights tortured my blind spots as I lay limp and useless. The engine whirred. My midnight pursuer was somewhere in the blur, waiting to churn me under his wheels. I had to get up or I would satiate his appetite. The only hope that I hung on to was the abandoned radio station that was definitely somewhere near. After running chaotically for minutes that seemed like hours, I finally saw it. In a cleared out part of the thicket, the narrow building stretched out wide and gleaming. Metallic crisscross patterns towered further away. Though the engine sounds had died and given voice to the gloomy stillness around me, I knew that he may already have been on foot by then. My only safe bet was to get in. I kicked open the grey rickety door that had a white board nailed to it. 93.5, the flaming star, guiding you through the night. In a fancy old cursive font. It was musty and pitch black. I coughed violently and tripped along my way. A rack of old joint chairs by the side and the spiderwebs laden with soot spread evenly across the corridors. Someone who clearly was not a graffiti artist had sprayed black paint on the walls. Hell hasn't faded, it read. I pushed those chairs and semblances of old furniture, parts of which had been shredded and strewn everywhere, against the doors, shutting it as hard as I could. Taking out my phone, I switched on the flashlight. A hopelessly empty horizontal line without any of the vertical bars upon it made me forget about calling the police. My foray into the corridors began with the particles of dust dancing in front of my eyes. Somewhere along the way, there was a break in case of emergency panel with a rusted axe encased. I chanced upon the door that read "Control Room" and I pushed it open with all my force. My heart drummed against my chest and begged to tear out into the open. Ham radio setting with a disc reel platters played on a rickety desk along with receivers and other drab boxes. I coughed again uncontrollably. Oh no. Next, there were loud thuds on the door and sounds of chain rattling, along with tumbling wooden planks from further beyond the room. All I could do was hide in a corner and suppress my allergy. I sank down to my knees in the dark and palpitated all over. Slimy sweat poured onto my pale, bloody forehead as the banging continued. He was out there trying to get to me, and there was no option left but to face him. The rusted axe came to my mind. I went out to the corridor, trying to still my wobbly legs. Each loud thud sent tremors up to my chest. All that remained in place were the chairs, everything else had been thrust aside. Come on in, you fool, I whispered at the darkness. The banging stopped all of a sudden, leaving me cold and senseless. Something squeaked from the other room. The fat rolls of tape were spinning on their own, on a wide platter. I couldn't understand if I were hallucinating due to extreme anxiety. Good evening, dear rowdies and doves. Flaming Star Radio humming your tunes as you drive past the highways. Spoke some guy from somewhere in a quirky manner. I'm Mitch, and we have with us today Police Officer Samson DeVille. Good evening, sir. A very good evening to you, too. What the hell is going on? I was losing my mind as I caught onto my scrambled hair and tried to rip it apart. We have the very latest on the drive-in killer, after the gruesome twin murders of Emily Jackson and Ronald Harding on April 2nd. Sources say he drives through the Highway 16 between 3 and 4. Gruff and unclear sounds of the speaker clearing his throat sounded along with all the buzzing static. Officer, I have to ask, is there anything you would like to say to the local population? I shattered the glass pane and took the damn thing out. I would like to take this opportunity and tell everyone and anyone listening right now not to panic. We are nothing but a call away, and we have deployed all our units to roadblocks to catch the sucker. We even have the permits to do so, so please stay indoors at night till we get him. And that we eventually will. Oh man, 1979 was going away on quite a note. But this, hopefully you listeners out there don't do anything stupid like. The spinning wheels of tape stopped midway as I brought down my axe onto the metallic platters, smashed their spindles, and toppled the array of transceivers, speakers, and amplifiers with it, watching sparks fly everywhere along with my rage. I tried hard to cave the blade into the battered control knobs, not knowing where I was going with that act. I ran out when the whole set of broken equipment turned to flames. I did not stop to think how that happened, given that there was no power running through the shutdown building. I held the axe and wheezed and gasped to get out of the stifling darkness, kicked away the barricade of wood that held against the door, and ran through the low hanging trees. It was freezing outside as though the temperature suddenly dropped to an all time low. I reached the road and turned to find smoke billowing from far. The building was on fire and crimson glowered through the dark winding trees. He was standing there, underneath one of those trees, wearing a tattered trench coat and baggy pants. Even though his still face was a dark shadow, I could tell that he eyed me from where he stood. I shivered at the center of a world that shook around me as I let out a primordial scream and threw the axe at him, only to watch it dissolve through his lanky frame. That was when I turned and ran like a patient trying to escape an asylum. I kept running and tore through the cold till my eyes blacked out and my senses failed, and the rest was all a blur. I thrust a swaddle of notes into Harry's crowded desk and avoided one of his snobbish stares. Small time couldn't get any smaller, I thought in agony, as I rolled my bag up to where the Silverado was parked. They picked me up, the cops probably explained Harry's attitude, since he was less of the genial man who ran miles for the little extra than before. I was mistaken for one of those homeless, wounded vagabonds in stolen rags, lying wasted on the roads in front of the petrol pump. One of his prestigious daytime employees had the good sense to report me without even bothering to wake me up. The funny thing was that it seemed as though I wasn't the first. But then the cops had other more worthwhile things in their agenda for that day, like assisting local firefighters who extinguished the flames of a burning radio station, one that had been abandoned for years and that was now reduced to shambles. Easy on the district authorities and demolition crews, I thought. The fire would have consumed the woods had the heroes not arrived on time, spoke the unattractive female reporter from the television that hung from the faded walls at the police station. I was all patched up and ready to run away for good. Had been doing that a lot lately, this time back to the city, the place that I tried to leave behind. Hours later, I was driving on Highway 16, unmindful of the trucks that vibrated past, or the roadies on their cruisers who drove insane speeds to overtake me, or even the deep orange rays of the evening sunlight that blinded me through the windshield. The road and its yellow markers extended forever into the fading sun. And all that I cared about, every time I looked warily into the rearview mirrors, was that if a Mercury Bobcat drove behind. The end.